I jolted awake to the sound of my phone vibrating on the nightstand. Squinting at the caller ID, my heart dropped. It was Derek, my abusive ex-husband who had made my life a living hell for years. I let it go to voicemail, not wanting to hear his menacing voice. But the message he left chilled me to the bone. "I know all about your new husband and kid," Derek growled. "You think you can just move on and replace me? You're going to regret this. I'm going to make you pay for what you've done." My hands trembled as I clutched the phone. Derek's vicious words transported me back to the darkest days of our marriage. The constant put-downs, the explosions of rage whenever I didn't obey his every demand, the sickening thud of his fist against my body when I disappointed him. I had escaped that nightmare, finally feeling free when the divorce was finalized. But Derek's message made it clear. The terror wasn't over. Michael stirred beside me. "Rach, what's wrong?" His concerned eyes searched my face in the dim light. I swallowed hard, trying to keep my voice steady. "It's Derek. He knows about us, about Tommy, and he's threatening revenge." Michael pulled me close, his strong arms providing little comfort. We had met 2 years after my divorce, when I was a struggling single mom working double shifts to support Tommy. Michael's kindness and patience helped me start healing from the trauma Derek inflicted. For the first time in years, I felt safe and loved. But now Derek had resurfaced like a malignant tumor. His twisted jealousy and obsession wouldn't allow me to move on. Tears rolled down my cheeks as the gravity of his threats sank in. My new life, my fresh start, all of it was in jeopardy because of my monster of an ex-husband. The next morning, I made the difficult call to the police about Derek's threatening voicemail. An officer came to take my statement while Michael held me, his thumb gently stroking my arm in a calming gesture. I tried to keep my composure as I recounted Derek's vicious words. "He's just trying to scare you," the officer said flatly after I finished. "But based on his history, I'd advise getting a restraining order." A restraining order? The thought made my stomach twist into knots. Even with a piece of paper, I knew Derek's twisted obsession wouldn't be deterred so easily. Michael must have sensed my trepidation. "It's the right move," he assured me. "We have to do everything we can to protect you and Tommy." I gave a reluctant nod, feeling drained from rehashing my painful past yet again. But Michael was right. We couldn't take any chances when it came to my son's safety. A few days later, the doorbell rang just after Tommy got home from school. Assuming it was a neighbor kid, I opened it without checking the peephole first. A sickening wave of dread washed over me when I saw the hulking figure on my doorstep. Well, if it isn't my replacement," Derek sneered, beer gut spilling over his waistline as he looked me up and down with undisguised contempt. "You're violating the restraining order," I shouted, panic gripping me. "Get off my property." "Our property," he countered with a cruel smile. "I helped pay for this place, remember?" That's when Tommy came bounding up behind me. "Who's that, Mommy?" Derek's eyes narrowed as they settled on my son. "So this is the brat keeping us apart, huh?" His voice dripped with disdain. I immediately shielded Tommy, glaring defiantly at my ex-husband. "Don't you dare talk about him like that. Just leave us alone, Derek," he responded with a mocking laugh. "You're kidding yourself if you think I'll let some other man raise my flesh and blood. This situation is far from over." With a hard shove, Derek pushed past me into the house. Terror gripped me as I watched his massive frame fill the doorway, invading the one place I'd finally felt safe. "Get out!" I screamed at the top of my lungs. "Michael, call the police!" Derek shot me one last vindictive glare before turning on his heel and storming off. I slammed the door behind him, locking it with shaking hands as sobs of panic and rage racked my body. How could I ever feel safe again when that monster knew where we lived? When he'd already violated the restraining order and threatened to take Tommy from me? Derek's vile, unrelenting vendetta had begun. Despite the restraining order, Derek's campaign of terror against me only intensified in the weeks that followed. He would lurk near my workplace, glaring menacingly until I was forced to leave in tears. Disturbing packages arrived at our home, graphic photos from our marriage, reminders of the abuse he inflicted. "This has to stop," Michael stated firmly one night as I sobbed on the couch, holding the latest vile delivery. "He's torturing you." "I know," I replied bitterly. "But restraining orders are just pieces of paper to Derek. He doesn't care about laws or consequences. That's when the phone rang. Knowing it was him, I let it go to voicemail. Derek's chilling voice soon echoed from the speaker. Having fun with your new little family? Don't get too comfortable. I'm not through ruining your life like you ruined mine. In fact, I've got some help making things extra miserable. At that moment, a car door slammed outside. I tensed, fearing Derek was about to make another unannounced visit, but it was the sound of high heels clacking up the front walk. Michael and I exchanged a puzzled look as the doorbell rang. A statuesque blonde in a tight dress and 6-inch stilettos sneered at me when I answered. "Rachel, I'm Stacy, Derek's new girlfriend." My blood turned to ice at her vindictive tone. "What do you want?" "Just to give you a taste of what you've got coming," she hissed. "Derek may have been a fool to marry a ugly little thing like you, but I've got his back now in making your life hell." With that, Stacy raised her sunglasses and purposely winked at Michael in a blatant attempt to demean me further. I saw red, my fist clenching with fury. "You two deserve each other," I spat. "A couple of soulless, bottom-feeding trash." Stacy responded by spitting a gooey loogie that landed squarely on my face. I recoiled in horror and disgust as she cackled like a hyena. "See you around, Rachel. This is just the beginning." Slamming the door, I crumpled into Michael's arms, my body racked with sobs. How could Derek's vindictive obsession go so far as to enlist an equally vile accomplice? Did he truly have no depths he wouldn't stoop to? For the sake of my sanity and Tommy's well-being, I had no choice but to quit my job. Derek and Stacy's relentless stalking made it impossible to work. I felt powerless, a prisoner in my own home. One afternoon, movement outside caught my eye. I gasped in horror as Stacy's convertible rolled by, with a chilling sight in the back seat. It was a mutilated doll, designed to look just like me, hanging from a noose. The depraved threat couldn't have been more clear. I collapsed to the floor in panicked sobs, holding Tommy tightly. Derek and his deranged accomplice wouldn't stop until I paid the ultimate price for leaving him. After the disturbing doll incident, I knew I couldn't go on living under Derek's dark cloud of terror. Michael and I made the agonizing decision to involve my parents, as much as I dreaded revisiting those painful memories. Mom and Dad arrived at our doorstep that weekend, enveloping me in their warm embraces, but the look of grave concern on their faces showed they could sense how dire the situation had become. "This ex of yours sounds like a total psychopath," Dad stated bluntly after we filled them in. "The police clearly aren't doing enough to protect you." "He's never going to stop," I said bitterly, holding back tears. "Derek's deranged obsession runs too deep. He won't rest until he's completely destroyed me." Mom placed a reassuring hand on my arm. "Then we fight back, honey. We're not going to let that monster take anything else from you." Her determined words helped steel my resolve. If the authorities wouldn't intervene, perhaps it was time to take matters into our own hands, to finally regain control from Derek's reign of terror. The next week, Mom and Dad hired a private investigator, a burly former cop named Frank. His gruff demeanor and no-nonsense attitude inspired confidence that he could unearth the truth about Derek's shady dealings. "This scumbag's got skeletons in his closet," Frank assured us at the start. "We just gotta crack that safe wide open and let the roaches scatter." True to his word, the PI soon began turning up a trail of illicit activities. Fraudulent loans, under-the-table business deals, even alleged ties to organized crime. It became clear that Derek's public persona as a successful entrepreneur was a carefully constructed facade. "This is the leverage we need," Michael stated after reviewing the incriminating evidence. "If he won't back off, we plaster all this everywhere and bury him." A grim smile crossed my lips as I pictured the look on Derek's smug face when his web of deceit unraveled. For so long he'd held all the power, mocking the law, trampling my rights, terrorizing me with impunity. But now, at long last, the scales were tipped in my favor. We instructed my lawyer to set up a face-to-face meeting with Derek and his attorney. When he arrived with Stacy in tow, I couldn't help but feel a rush of satisfaction at his pale, unsettled look. For once, the bully was running scared. "Here's the deal," my lawyer stated, sliding the thick file of evidence across the table. "You leave Rachel and her family alone once and for all, or this all goes public. The IRS, the police, the media, everyone." Derek's beady eyes flitted over the documents, his pasty face turning even whiter. I could practically smell the fear oozing from his pores. Stacy, too, looked like she might faint. "Well," I prodded, arms folded, "what's it going to be?" In that moment, Derek's signature arrogant sneer returned. With a contemptuous chuckle, he shoved the file aside. "You're bluffing, and even if you weren't, it doesn't matter. Nothing will stop me from taking back what's mine." My heart sank as the gravity of his refusal hit me. Derek would never, ever back down, no matter what we threatened. His vengeance against me was more precious than his money or freedom. As he stormed out, I turned to Michael with a grim realization. We were out of options. It was time to go nuclear on Derek, to finally destroy the monster once and for all. Derek's arrogant dismissal of our leverage lit a fire under me. For too long I had played by the rules while he trampled all over them. If he wanted a war, I would give him one, and make sure he paid dearly. The next morning I marched into my lawyer's office with a cold determination. "Release everything to the press," I instructed. "Every dirty dealing, every shady business tie, every cent of ill-gotten gain, plaster it on the front pages and lead stories." My lawyer raised an eyebrow. "You understand this is nuclear, Rachel. There's no going back once we pull this trigger." I gave a resolute nod. Derek left me no choice. It's time he finally faces real consequences for his actions. Within days, the bombshell exposes began detonating in the media. Reporters swarmed Derek's offices and fancy country club, peppering him with questions about the lurid allegations. His sleazy deals with mobsters and white-collar fraud quickly became broadcast across every TV channel and news website. I watched with a sort of grim satisfaction as Derek's world rapidly unraveled before him. One by one, his business partners and corporate backers began severing ties. The IRS launched an investigation, freezing his assets and bank accounts. Even Stacy abandoned him once the depths of his lies and criminal conduct became public. Derek responded with predictable rage, barraging me with threatening calls and texts laced with profanity. He showed up at our home twice, pounding on the door until police hauled him away in handcuffs. On the second occasion, I could see the fight had drained from his eyes, replaced by a dead, empty look. The final stake was driven through his black heart when Derek's former company uncovered proof he had embezzled funds and completely fired him. I'll never forget the moment he realized he had officially lost everything: his riches, his reputation, his freedom, potentially. Sitting in the courtroom watching Derek's public shaming was perhaps the sweetest form of revenge. With each salacious allegation, each bombshell revelation read aloud, I could see him shrinking smaller and smaller into himself. The smug arrogance that had fueled his reign of terror over me had finally been leached away. When it was my turn on the stand, I looked Derek squarely in his beady eyes as I recounted the litany of abuse, both physical and emotional, he had subjected me to for years. How his controlling, violent behavior had made my life a nightmare. How he forced me to live in constant fear and degradation. "That's why I had to take such drastic action," I stated, my voice steady and firm. "Derek Jacobs is a sociopathic criminal who believed he could act without impunity. He needed to learn there are consequences for tormenting and terrorizing others." In that moment, I knew I had regained the power Derek fought so hard to keep me from having. As he sat humiliated before the world, I could finally breathe freely without his vice-like grip on my life. The monster had been slayed. In the aftermath of Derek's spectacular downfall, the disgraced monster's life continued its freefall into total ruin. With his assets frozen and ill-gotten wealth seized, he was rendered broke and homeless within weeks. One afternoon, I answered a frantic knock at the door to find Stacy on my doorstep, eyes puffy from crying. "I'm sorry," she blubbered, a mere shell of her former arrogant self. "Derek's gone completely off the rails. He's been hitting me, accusing me of helping to take him down." I felt a pang of satisfaction seeing the wretched accomplice getting her comeuppance. "I have no sympathy for you," I stated coldly. "You're just as guilty as Derek of making my life hell." "You've got to help me," Stacy pleaded, desperation in her voice. "He's capable of anything in his state. What if he comes after Tommy next?" The thought of Derek's vengeance turning towards my son made my blood run cold. As much as I disliked Stacy, I knew I couldn't risk giving that monster another opening. Michael and I ended up calling the police and getting an order of protection against Derek for all of us, including Stacy in her role as a victim. Little did I know that within days, it would prove absolutely vital. I'll never forget the night I awoke to the sound of a terrifying commotion downstairs. Metallic crashing noises and guttural, animalistic growls echoing through the house. Michael shook me urgently awake as I realized what was happening. Derek had found a way inside. "Stay here and lock the door," Michael shouted, grabbing a baseball bat before racing into the hallway. More bone-chilling shouts and bangs rang out, making my heart jackhammer with terror. I clutched Tommy tightly as heavy footsteps started pounding up the staircase. Suddenly, the door burst open with a splintering crack, and there was Derek, eyes bulging with unhinged rage. "You're dead," he bellowed, spittle flying from his contorted mouth. "You hear me? I'll kill every last one of you for what you did." Before I could even scream, Michael appeared behind Derek and swung the bat squarely into the back of his skull with a loud, nauseating thwack. Derek crumpled to the floor with a groan, finally subdued. The police arrived within minutes, hauling my deranged ex away in handcuffs. Michael and I could only watch in stunned silence, holding each other and Tommy close. From there, things moved swiftly. Derek's final act of depraved violence was the last straw, allowing me to file for an indefinite restraining order and an emergency custody order to keep him away from Tommy permanently. At the custody hearing, every last one of Derek's vile transgressions was finally laid bare before the court. The years of abuse I endured, his unrelenting campaign of terror and stalking, the violent home invasion that proved he was a clear threat to our family's safety. One by one, the damning pieces of evidence piled up until Derek had nowhere left to hide. When the judge handed down his ruling, I could finally exhale the breath I'd been holding for a decade. Full, permanent custody was awarded to me, with Derek's visitation rights permanently severed. The bastard had lost any shred of control over me or my son. As the bailiffs led Derek out, he turned with one last hateful glare, his eyes burning with impotent rage. "I'll get you for this," he growled gutturally. "Even from behind bars, I'll destroy you." I simply shook my head slowly and returned his gaze with a look of pity. "It's over, Derek. You have no power here." And just like that, the long nightmare was finally over. The demon had been exorcised from my life forever. The culmination of my years-long battle against Derek's depravity came at his sentencing hearing. As I sat in the courtroom, I could feel the weight of the past decade finally being lifted from my shoulders. Derek was led in wearing an orange jumpsuit, his hands and feet shackled. Gone was the designer suit armor he once hid behind. He was finally stripped bare before the world, exposed as the true monster he was. One by one, a parade of witnesses took the stand to recount Derek's litany of crimes and irredeemable acts. Businessmen he had defrauded and strong-armed, former employees who endured his tyrannical abuse and labor violations, criminals he consorted with in his illegal dealings. It seemed to go on forever, each damning allegation compounding into an insurmountable pile of indefensible evidence against him. Derek's lawyer could only sit in glum silence, unable to mount any defense against the overwhelming facts. When it was finally my turn, I approached the stand with my head held high, no longer afraid to look the demon that had haunted me for so long. Derek met my gaze with a seething look of pure hatred. "That's the face of the man who made my life a living hell for over a decade," I stated firmly, "who robbed me of my self-worth, my sense of security, my very soul at times." I recounted in lurid detail the various acts of physical, emotional, and psychological abuse Derek had subjected me to throughout our marriage. The explosive rages whenever I defied him, the demeaning insults and mind games, the bruises, the broken bones, the torment that became my inescapable reality. He treated me as his possession to be controlled rather than his wife to be loved and cherished, I said, struggling to maintain my composure as the memories washed over me. Derek Jacobs is a sociopath, plain and simple, devoid of empathy or human decency. Finally, I turned to address Derek directly, staring unafraid into the void of his soulless eyes. "You don't scare me anymore," I proclaimed, my voice resolute and unwavering. "You're a bully and a coward who could only dominate through violence and intimidation. But I've taken back the power you tried so desperately to keep me from having. You have no hold over me or my son any longer." Derek responded by leaping up and unleashing a guttural, incoherent roar of rage, startling everyone in the room. It took 3 bailiffs to restrain him as he thrashed violently in their grip. "You'll burn for this," he bellowed at me, spittle flying from his contorted mouth. "I'll haunt you from the depths of hell itself. You hear me? This isn't over." I simply shook my head slowly, feeling utterly unmoved by his empty threats. "You're already dead to me, Derek. Sentencing you is just putting your corpse in the ground where it belongs." In the end, the judge handed down a decades-long prison sentence for Derek's multitude of crimes: financial fraud, racketeering, tax evasion, and more. He would likely spend the rest of his life behind bars, his freedom permanently stripped. As they hauled Derek away, he turned towards me one last time, a look of pure, undisguised hatred etched across his bloated face. In that moment, I realized his toxic obsession would never end, even after all this. He would carry that bitter, all-consuming resentment towards me until his dying day. But as for me, I felt more liberated than I had in years. The burden had finally been lifted. The cycle of torment was over. Derek's ultimate punishment wasn't just the prison sentence, but having to live out his remaining days knowing he had irrevocably lost. That, despite his best efforts, he couldn't break me. I had conquered the demon, and he would have to seethe over that truth until his last, anguished breath. With Derek finally behind bars, the dark cloud that had lingered over my life for so long had lifted at last. I could breathe freely, sleep soundly through the night, and live without constantly fearing his vindictive obsession. In the months after his sentencing, I watched Derek's life of privilege and excess become a distant memory. His luxury cars, mansions, and ill-gotten riches were all seized and liquidated by the authorities. The vain trappings he had used to glorify his ego and stroke his depraved sense of power over others were systematically stripped away. It was almost poetic justice seeing this man who had derived so much joy from inflicting pain and torment on me end up destitute and disgraced. Forced to trade his tailored suits for a drab prison jumpsuit, his lavish penthouse for a cramped cell, his exorbitant meals for inedible swill. Derek's world had shrunk down to the harsh, bare-bones existence he so richly deserved. I refused to take any pleasure in his downfall, however. My victory wasn't about seeing him suffer, but rather ensuring he could never again inflict his brand of cruelty on me or anyone else. With Derek securely caged, I could finally begin reclaiming the life he had tried so hard to break. That summer, Michael, Tommy, and I took our first real family vacation, a glorious week in Hawaii to celebrate leaving our long nightmare behind for good. As we walked along the beach, hand in hand, I couldn't stop smiling at how far we'd come. "You're free now, babe," Michael said, squeezing my fingers. "Free from his shadow, free from the fear and the pain he inflicted on you for so long." I leaned in and kissed him tenderly. "I know, and it's all because of you. Because you gave me the love and strength to stand up to that monster." Tommy came running up, giggling as he kicked up sand. "Look, Mommy, I got a pretty seashell for you." Scooping my beaming son into my arms, I felt an overwhelming wave of peace and gratitude wash over me. For the first time in over a decade, I was truly, blissfully happy. Those idyllic days in paradise were just the beginning of my new life. A life free from Derek's toxic presence and the trauma he had inflicted. In the years that followed, I watched Tommy blossom into a confident, caring young man, completely untainted by his biological father's ugliness. Michael continued showering us both with unconditional love and patience, providing the stable family environment I had craved for so long. We eventually renewed our vows in an intimate beach ceremony, cementing our vow to forge ahead as partners for life. There were still the occasional reminders of my past. A news article about Derek's latest appeal being rejected, a letter from his lawyer filled with the same tired vitriol. I would simply shake my head and discard them into the trash, feeling utterly unbothered. His venom had lost its potency. On the eve of the 10-year anniversary of Derek's imprisonment, I gathered some old belongings to discard, the tattered remains of the life he had systematically tried to destroy. His words still burned into my memory. "I'll haunt you from the depths of hell itself. You hear me? This isn't over." A sad, hollow threat from a sad, hollow husk of a man. As I tossed the box of memories into the fire pit and struck a match, I watched the pages curl and blacken. Derek's snarling, demonic visage fading to ash on the summer night breeze. With Michael and Tommy by my side, I felt a profound sense of closure and victory. The demons had finally been purged. Derek's reign of terror was a distant ember, glowing for a few fleeting moments before dimming out completely. As the last licks of fire died, I turned to face my family, the people who had loved and supported me through the darkest of times. Michael smiled at me, placing his hand over my heart. "It's just us now," he said softly. "The future is wide open." I pulled them both close and looked ahead, eager to begin walking the path towards the beautiful life I had worked so hard to build from the wreckage. Derek was in my rearview mirror once and for all, a specter of misery and hatred ill-equipped to haunt the light I had chosen to follow. Justice, peace, and the most purest form of revenge had been achieved. Happiness.